rise up before you and plead in your hearts for his offspring? Perhaps he has a mother and a home. Think of the lengthened shadows that must have been cast over that home by his absence. Think of his mother during those hours of wretchedness, when she has felt hope darkening into disappointment, next into anxiety, and from anxiety into despair. How often may she have stretched forth her hands in supplication, and asked even the winds of heaven to bring her tidings of him who was away? Let the supplications of that mother touch your hearts, and shield their object from the law. After a luminous charge by Judge Story, the jury retired to agree upon their verdict, and at 9 o'clock the next morning came in with their verdict. Clerk. Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict? Jury. We have. Clerk. Who shall speak for you? Jury. Our foreman. The prisoners were then directed severally to rise as soon as called and receive the verdict of the jury. The captain, Pedro Gilbert, was the first named. He arose, raised his hand, and regarded the jury with a firm countenance and steady eye. Clerk. Jurors, look upon the prisoner. Prisoner, look upon the jurors. How say you, gentlemen, is the prisoner at the bar, Pedro Gilbert, guilty or not guilty? Foreman. Guilty. The same verdict was pronounced against De Soto the mate, Ruiz the carpenter, Boyga, Castillo, Garcia, and Montenegro. But Costa the cabin boy, Ferrer the negro, Guzman, Portana, and Velasquez were declared not guilty. After having declared the verdict of the jury, the foreman read to the court the following recommendation to mercy. The sympathies of the jury have been strongly moved in behalf of Bernardo de Soto on account of his generous, noble, and self-sacrificing conduct in saving the lives of more than 70 human beings, constituting the passengers and crew of the ship Minerva, and they desire that his case should be presented to the merciful consideration of the government. Judge Story replied that the wish of the jury would certainly be complied with both by the court and the prosecuting officer. The appearance and demeanor of Captain Gilbert are the same as when we first saw him. His eye is undimmed, and decision and command yet sit upon his features. We did not discern the slightest alteration of color or countenance when the verdict of the jury was communicated to him. He merely slightly bowed and resumed his seat. With De Soto the case was different. He was much altered, has become thinner, and his countenance this morning was expressive of the deepest despondency. When informed of the contents of the paper read by the foreman of the jury, he appeared much affected, and while being removed from the court, covered his face with his handkerchief. Immediately after the delivery of the verdict, the acquitted prisoners, on motion of Mr. Hillard, were directed to be discharged, upon which several of the others loudly and angrily expressed their dissatisfaction at the result of the trial. Castillo, the half-caste, with an extremely mild and pleasing countenance, pointed towards heaven, and called upon the Almighty to bear witness that he was innocent. Ruiz uttered some words with great vehemence, and Garcia said all were in the same ship, and it was strange that some should be permitted to escape, while others were punished. Most of them, on leaving the court, uttered some invective against the picaro who had sworn their lives away. On Costa, the cabin boy, aged 16, being declared not guilty, some degree of approbation was manifested by the audience, but instantly checked by the judge, who directed the officers to take into custody every one expressing either assent or dissent. We certainly think the sympathy expressed in favor of Costa very ill placed, for although we have not deemed ourselves at liberty to mention the fact earlier, his conduct during the whole trial was characterized by the most reckless effrontery and indecorum. Even when standing up to receive the verdict of the jury, his face bore an impudent smile, and he evinced the most total disregard of the mercy which had been extended towards him. About this time vague rumors reached Corunna that a captain belonging to that place engaged in the slave trade had turned pirate, been captured, and sent to America with his crew for punishment. Report at first fixed it upon a noted slave dealer named Begaro, but the astounding intelligence soon reached Senora de Soto that her husband was the person captured for this startling crime. The shock to her feelings was terrible, but her love and fortitude surmounted them all, and she determined to brave the terrors of the ocean, to intercede for her husband if condemned, and at all events behold him once more. A small schooner was freighted by her own and husband's father, and in it she embarked for New York. After a boisterous passage, The vessel reached that port when she learned her husband had already been tried and condemned to die. The humane people of New York advised her to hasten on to Washington and plead with the President for a pardon. On arriving at the capital, she solicited an interview with General Jackson, which was readily granted. From the circumstance of her husband's having saved the lives of 70 Americans, a merciful ear was turned to her solicitations, and a pardon for De Soto was given her, with which she hastened to Boston and communicated to him the joyful intelligence. Andrew Jackson, President of the United States of America, to all to whom these presents shall come, greeting. Whereas, at the October term 1834 of the Circuit Court of the United States, Bernardo de Soto was convicted of piracy and sentenced to be hung on the 11th day of March last, from which sentence a respite was granted to him for 3 months, bearing date the 3rd day of March 1835, also a subsequent one dated on the 5th day of June 1835 for 60 days, and whereas the said Bernardo de Soto has been represented as a fit subject for executive clemency, now therefore I, Andrew Jackson, President of the United States of America, in consideration of the premises, divers good and sufficient causes me thereto moving, have pardoned, and hereby do pardon the said Bernardo de Soto, from and after the 11th of August next, and direct he be then discharged from confinement. In testimony whereof I have hereunto subscribed my name, and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed to these presents. Done at the city of Washington, the 6th day of July, Anno Domini 1835, and of the independence of the United States, and 60th, Andrew Jackson. On the fatal morning of June 11th, 1835, Don Pedro, Juan Montenegro, Manuel Castillo, Angel Garcia, and Manuel Boyga were, agreeably to sentence, summoned to prepare for immediate execution. On the night previous, a mutual agreement had been entered into to commit suicide. Angel Garcia made the first attempt by trying to open the veins of each arm with a piece of glass, but was prevented. In the morning, however, while preparations were making for the execution, Boyga succeeded in inflicting a deep gash on the left side of his neck with a piece of tin. The officer's eyes had been withdrawn from him scarcely a minute before he was discovered lying on his pallet, with a convulsive motion of his knees, from loss of blood. Medical aid was at hand, the gash sewed up, but he did not revive. 2 Catholic clergymen attended them on the scaffold, one a Spanish priest. They were executed in the rear of the jail. When the procession arrived at the foot of the ladder leading up to the platform of the gallows, the Reverend Mr. Varella looked directly at Captain Gilbert and said, "Spaniards, ascend to heaven." Don Pedro mounted with a quick step, and was followed by his comrades at a more moderate pace, but without the least hesitation. Boyga, unconscious of his situation and destiny, was carried up in a chair, and seated beneath the rope prepared for him. Gilbert, Montenegro, Garcia, and Castillo all smiled subduedly as they took their stations on the platform. Soon after Captain Gilbert ascended the scaffold, he passed over to where the apparently lifeless Boyga was seated in the chair, and kissed him. Addressing his followers, he said, "Boys, we are going to die, but let us be firm, for we are innocent." To Mr. Peyton, the interpreter, he said, "I die innocent, but I'll die like a noble Spaniard. Goodbye, brother." The marshal having read the warrant for their execution, and stated that De Soto was respited 60 and Ruiz 30 days, the ropes were adjusted round the necks of the prisoners, and a slight hectic flush spread over the countenance of each. But not an eye quailed, nor a limb trembled, not a muscle quivered. The fatal cord was now cut, and the platform fell, by which the prisoners were launched into eternity. After the execution was over, Ruiz, who was confined in his cell, attracted considerable attention by his maniac shouts and singing. At one time holding up a piece of blanket stained with Boyga's blood, he gave utterance to his ravings in a sort of recitative, the burden of which was, "This is the red flag my companions died under." After the expiration of Ruiz's second respite, the marshal got 2 surgeons of the United States Navy, who understood the Spanish language, to attend him in his cell. They, after a patient examination, pronounced his madness a counterfeit, and his insanity a hoax. Accordingly, in the morning of September 11th, The Marshal, in company with a Catholic priest and interpreter, entered his cell, and made him sensible that longer